My husband never let me answer the landline. Years later, I finally learned who was always on the other end. I want to start with the sound of it, because I think that's what stayed with me longest. That particular double ring the old phone made, a little sharper and more insistent than any cell phone tone, cutting through whatever room we happened to be in. And the sound that always followed it, my husband's chair scraping back, his footsteps moving quickly toward the kitchen, his voice already lowered to something careful and private, before he'd even picked up the receiver. This isn't a story about a hidden woman, or a secret debt, or anything that would have justified the quiet dread I sometimes let myself feel late at night, listening to my husband murmur into that phone behind a half-closed door. This is a story about a man named Owen, a diagnosis no one in his family knew how to speak about out loud, and a brother who protected him so completely that he was willing to let his own wife wonder, for over a decade, what he could possibly be hiding. I think you should understand, before I describe those calls, what kind of man my husband Daniel was, because I don't want you to imagine ours was a marriage built on obvious distrust. Daniel was steady in almost every visible way. He came home on time, told me where he'd been, never once gave me reason to check his phone or question where our money went. The landline was the single unexplained thing in an otherwise transparent life, which is exactly why it took root in my mind the way it did, small and persistent, like a stone in a shoe you keep meaning to shake out and never quite do. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's wedding in our mid-20s, both of us slightly out of place among the loud, celebratory chaos of the reception, and we spent most of that evening talking quietly at the edge of the dance floor instead of joining it. He struck me, even then, as a person who held things carefully, who chose his words with a kind of deliberate weight that made you feel, when he finally spoke, that whatever he said had been considered from every angle first. I loved that about him from the beginning, though I would come to understand, much later, exactly how much careful weighing he had learned to do, and why. We kept that landline for reasons that had nothing to do with necessity. By the time we married, in our late 20s, almost no one we knew still paid for one. Our friends teased us about it at dinner parties, the old beige phone mounted on the kitchen wall like a relic from another decade, and Daniel always laughed it off the same way, saying his mother liked being able to reach him on a number that never changed, an explanation reasonable enough that I never thought to push past it in the early years. It was the specific ritual around the phone that eventually became impossible to ignore. It rang most often on Sunday evenings, sometimes on Wednesday nights, always at roughly the same hours, and Daniel would answer it before the second ring finished, every single time, no matter what we were doing, no matter whether we had guests over or were in the middle of dinner. He would carry the receiver into the small mudroom off our kitchen, pull the door mostly shut behind him, and speak in a voice pitched low enough that I could hear the rhythm of his words, but almost never the content. 20 minutes, sometimes closer to 40, before he emerged again, usually quieter than when he'd left, sometimes visibly tired around the eyes in a way he never fully explained. I asked him about it early on, in our first year of marriage, directly enough that I expected a direct answer. He told me it was his mother, checking in the way mothers do, and that she preferred the landline because the connection was more reliable than his cell phone in her rural corner of the state. I believed him completely at first. It was a plausible story, offered without hesitation, and Daniel had never given me reason to doubt the plausible stories he told me about the rest of his life. It was my mother-in-law herself, oddly enough, who first cracked that explanation without meaning to. We were visiting her for a long weekend, perhaps 4 years into the marriage, and I mentioned, in passing, how nice it must be for her to have that reliable landline connection with Daniel every Sunday evening. She looked at me with a small, confused frown, and said she mostly just texted him, the way everyone did now, and hadn't called that old house line in years. I remember the specific feeling of that moment, not alarm exactly, but a kind of quiet reorganizing in my chest, the sense of a small piece of the world sliding slightly out of alignment. I remember, too, mentioning the phone once to my own mother, almost in passing, describing it the way you might describe any small domestic curiosity. She laughed and said Daniel probably just liked having one line that was entirely his own, a private corner in a marriage that otherwise shared everything. And for a while that explanation satisfied me nearly as much as the story about his mother had. It is strange, looking back, how many small, reasonable guesses I was willing to accept in place of simply asking the question directly and sitting with whatever discomfort the honest answer might have required of me. I didn't confront Daniel about it that weekend. I want to be honest that I turned it over privately for months afterward instead, watching the pattern more closely without ever naming what I was doing as watching. The calls continued exactly as they always had. Sunday evenings, sometimes Wednesdays, the same lowered voice, the same mostly closed door, the same faint tiredness in his face when he came back to whatever room I was in. I began keeping a kind of loose mental log, the way I imagine many of you listening have done with your own small, unexplained patterns, not out of any dramatic suspicion, but out of a need to simply understand the shape of something that didn't quite add up. I noticed the calls came almost exactly every 7 to 10 days. I noticed Daniel always seemed to know, somehow, when the phone was about to ring, glancing toward the kitchen a beat before that sharp double tone actually sounded, as though some part of him was permanently listening for it. There is a particular evening, about 6 years into our marriage, that I still think about often. I had answered our cell phones for years by then without a second thought. But that landline was different, an unspoken rule I had absorbed so thoroughly I no longer questioned it. That evening it rang while Daniel was upstairs in the shower, and I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, my hand actually hovering over the receiver, before I let it ring through to nothing at all. I remember feeling almost ashamed of the impulse, as though picking up my own household phone required some kind of permission I had never explicitly been denied but understood, on some instinctive level, not to test. I mentioned it once, carefully, to my closest friend, the way you might finally say out loud a worry you've been carrying quietly for a long time. She asked the obvious question, whether I thought there was another woman, and I remember answering honestly that I didn't believe that. Not really, because nothing else about Daniel's behavior fit that story. He was present, affectionate, entirely accounted for in every other hour of our life together. It was only that phone, that specific pocket of privacy, sealed off from me in a way nothing else in our marriage was. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who has quietly carried a small, unexplained pattern like this one, without ever finding quite the right moment to demand an answer. I think there is a particular kind of waiting that isn't passive at all, a patient, watchful trust that holds a question gently for years, not because you don't want the truth, but because some part of you senses the timing matters, that the person you love will tell you when they're ready, and that pushing too hard, too early, might close a door that patience could eventually open on its own. The full truth arrived, finally, in our 11th year of marriage, on an ordinary Wednesday evening that started exactly like hundreds before it. The phone rang. Daniel answered before the second ring, but this time, only a few minutes in, he came back into the kitchen, receiver still in hand, his face pale in a way I had never once seen during any of his other calls, and asked me, in a voice I barely recognized, to come sit down at the table with him. He told me, haltingly at first and then with a kind of exhausted relief, about his younger brother Owen, a name I had heard perhaps twice in 11 years of marriage, always mentioned briefly and vaguely as someone who lived out west and kept to himself. Owen was 3 years younger than Daniel and had been diagnosed in his early 20s with a severe anxiety disorder complicated by agoraphobia so profound that, for long stretches of his adult life, he had been unable to leave his apartment at all, sometimes for months at a time. Daniel told me their parents had never known how to speak about it openly, had treated it, in the language of an older generation, as something shameful to be managed quietly, rather than a genuine illness to be treated and discussed, and that Owen himself had absorbed that same shame so completely that he had made Daniel promise, years earlier, to keep his condition entirely private, even from the rest of the family, even from me. Daniel described, slowly, the year it had all started, when Owen was 22 and living alone for the first time in a small city 3 hours from their childhood home. He told me about the phone call that had frightened him more than any other in his life, Owen's voice thin and disoriented, describing a wave of panic so severe he had believed, in the moment, that he was dying. Daniel had driven through the night to reach him, had found his younger brother curled on the floor of a apartment he hadn't left in 9 days, and had understood, in that single unbearable night, that whatever came next would require a kind of quiet, unglamorous devotion no one else in the family seemed prepared to offer. He explained that the landline itself mattered enormously to Owen, in ways that took me time to fully understand. Owen's anxiety made cell phones feel exposed to him somehow, unpredictable, tied to a world of notifications and unknown callers that made his chest tighten before he even answered. The old landline, fixed in one place, ringing only for calls he had scheduled himself in advance, had become one of the very few reliable anchors in his life, a call he could prepare for, control, and trust completely, because only Daniel ever answered it, and only Daniel ever would. In other words, what I had spent a decade quietly wondering about wasn't a secret Daniel was keeping from me in any ordinary sense. It was a promise, made years before we ever met, to a brother whose entire fragile stability depended on the certainty that exactly one person and one phone would always be there, unchanged, unquestioned, and completely private. Daniel told me about the specific rhythm of those calls, how he had learned, over years, to recognize the particular quality of silence that meant Owen was having a difficult week versus a good one, how he had talked his brother through panic attacks at 2 a.m. during especially hard stretches, how he had quietly paid for a portion of Owen's therapy for years out of a separate account I had never thought to ask about, simply because Owen's own income, sporadic at best given his condition, could never have covered it alone. He told me he had never once considered telling me, not because he didn't trust me, but because the promise itself, the specific, narrow shape of it, had never included permission to widen the circle, and Owen's trust had always felt too fragile a thing to risk on his own account. He told me about the years in between, too. The ones I had witnessed only as unexplained Sunday evenings and Wednesday nights. There had been a stretch, around our 5th year of marriage, when Owen had made real progress, had started leaving his apartment for short walks, had even, for a few months, held a part-time remote job that gave him a sense of purpose. Daniel told me those calls during that period had been lighter, almost ordinary, brothers simply talking about nothing in particular. But there had also been harder stretches, a relapse after a failed relationship, a period of nearly total isolation following a difficult diagnosis appointment that had frightened Owen badly. And during those weeks the calls had stretched longer, sometimes past an hour, Daniel's voice growing quieter and more careful with every passing month, the tiredness in his eyes something I had noticed without ever understanding its source. I asked him, gently, why tonight, after 11 years, was different. He told me Owen had asked him to, finally, that his therapist had spent the last 2 years slowly helping him understand that shame kept in the dark tends to calcify, while shame spoken into a safe, trusted space tends to soften, and that Owen had decided, after a great deal of difficult internal work, that he wanted his brother's wife to know the truth, not as a formality, but because he had grown tired of being, in his own words to Daniel, a locked door in someone else's house. I sat with Daniel at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished, turning over 11 years of small, unexplained evenings, the tired eyes, the lowered voice, the door pulled almost shut. I felt no anger at all, only a kind of tender, aching respect for a man who had carried his brother's fragile dignity so carefully, for so long, that he had been willing to let his own wife wonder in silence, rather than risk breaking a promise made out of love. I asked if I could speak with Owen myself, and Daniel arranged it carefully. A video call this time rather than the landline, scheduled 2 weeks out to give Owen time to prepare himself for the unfamiliar step. Owen was soft-spoken, careful with his words, visibly nervous in a way that made my chest ache with a strange, protective tenderness for a man I had never met. He thanked me, in a halting voice, for the years I had apparently spent, without knowing it, giving Daniel the space to be there for him every single week, and told me he hoped, someday he might feel steady enough to meet me in person. He told me, that first call, a little about what those Sunday and Wednesday evenings had meant to him over the years, how the predictability of them, the same voice, the same time, the same unchanging line, had become one of the few reliable structures in a life that often felt, to him, dangerously unmoored. He said he used to sit by his own phone in the minutes before he called, rehearsing what he wanted to say, and that simply hearing Daniel's voice answer, steady and unhurried, had talked him back from the edge of more panic attacks than either of them could probably count. Listening to him describe it, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped even after Daniel's explanation. That phone hadn't just been a private line for two brothers. It had been, for Owen, something closer to a lifeline, dressed up in the ordinary shape of a household appliance. In other words, what I had once mistaken for a locked door was actually a bridge, one that had been quietly, carefully maintained for over a decade, load-bearing in ways I could never have guessed from the outside. I want to tell you what happened after that conversation, because I think the slow unfolding of it matters as much as the 11 years of quiet wondering that came before. Owen began, gradually, to widen his own circle beyond just Daniel. First a brief phone call with me directly, then, nearly a year later, a short, carefully planned visit to our home. His first time leaving his own apartment for an overnight trip in almost 6 years. I remember standing in our doorway watching him step out of the car, visibly trembling, visibly determined, and understanding, finally and completely, exactly what that old landline on our kitchen wall had been protecting all along. I want to tell you, too, about the first evening Owen actually stayed in our home overnight, because I think it captures something the rest of the story might not fully convey on its own. He arrived early in the afternoon, still visibly bracing himself against the unfamiliarity of a new house, a new city, a new set of walls he hadn't chosen and couldn't yet predict. Daniel had prepared everything with a care I recognized instantly as the same careful weighing I had loved in him since that wedding reception years earlier. The guest room arranged exactly the way Owen had described, feeling most comfortable. A specific brand of tea Owen liked already waiting in the cabinet, even the blinds adjusted to block out the particular angle of streetlight that Owen had once mentioned bothered him. Watching Daniel move through that quiet preparation, I understood, more fully than any explanation could have given me, the sheer scale of attention he had spent, invisibly, for over a decade, learning exactly how to make his brother feel safe. That evening, the three of us sat together in our living room far longer than any of us expected, Owen gradually relaxing into the unfamiliar space, telling small, funny stories about their childhood that made Daniel laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. A looser, easier laugh than the careful, contained version I usually saw. I remember thinking, watching them together, that I was finally seeing the full, uninterrupted shape of a relationship I had only ever glimpsed before in fragments, through a mostly closed door. I think about those 11 years often now, the specific ache of being gently shut out of a room I couldn't fully understand. And I want to say clearly, for anyone listening who has quietly wondered about a locked door, a lowered voice, a private call in their own home, not every closed door hides betrayal. Sometimes it hides someone else's carefully guarded survival, and the person keeping it closed isn't hiding something from you so much as protecting someone who isn't yet ready to be seen. I want to offer a few reflections for anyone listening who recognizes their own version of this story, some quiet, unexplained pattern in someone they love that has never quite been fully accounted for. Know that not every silence is a lie. Some silences are simply promises, kept faithfully, sometimes at real personal cost, because the person keeping them understands that trust, once broken, is rarely rebuilt as easily as it was lost. Understand that mental illness still carries a shame in many families that has nothing to do with the person suffering, and everything to do with generations who never learned how to speak about it honestly. Owen's silence wasn't weakness, it was armor built from a world that had rarely offered him softness instead. Remember that patience, in a marriage, is not the same as passivity. I waited 11 years for an answer I never once demanded, and I believe now that the waiting itself, offered without resentment, was part of what allowed Daniel to eventually trust me with the truth. Give yourself permission to feel proud of the people you love, for the burdens they carry quietly, even the ones you never got to see up close. Daniel never once asked for credit for the years he spent steadying his brother through the hardest stretches of his life. He simply did it, faithfully, week after week, because that is what love asked of him. Learn to notice the difference between a person pulling away from you and a person holding space open for someone else. It took me years to understand that Daniel's quiet retreat into that mudroom every week wasn't a withdrawal from our marriage at all. It was simply where his brother's fragile trust happened to live, and making room for it, rather than resenting it, turned out to be one of the truest measures of how well I loved him back. And believe, finally, that the people closest to us are often carrying entire private worlds we know nothing about, not out of deception, but out of care for someone else's fragile, ongoing survival. Sometimes all it takes is one honest evening at a kitchen table to finally understand the fuller shape of who they truly are. Owen still calls that same landline most Wednesday evenings, though now I answer it as often as Daniel does, and Owen and I have grown, slowly, into an easy, familiar warmth I never once expected during all those years of silent wondering. He tells me now, sometimes, that answering to a second voice on the other end no longer frightens him the way it once might have, that the line itself has simply widened, without losing any of the safety it always offered him. Daniel and I still keep that old phone mounted on the kitchen wall, long after most of the world has forgotten what a landline even sounds like, not out of necessity anymore, but because it has become, for all three of us, a small and lasting symbol of exactly how much quiet devotion a single unremarkable object can end up holding. I think often about how close I came to letting 11 years of unexplained evenings quietly erode something that had never actually been broken, and I am endlessly grateful that patience, and eventually the truth itself, showed me exactly what that phone on our kitchen wall had been guarding all along. If this story brought some value to your life, please consider clicking like. It is the only way we know this content was truly meaningful to you.